A book. Bars do not a prison make if one has a book to read. Stone and steel seem to disappear simply with the turn of the page. Adventures unfold, treasures untold, await those who venture within. A book will take you to places you've never been, places you never imagined you'd go. Places unseen, as if in a dream, places better than the place you're in. So walk away from that rerun TV, put down those dominoes, leave the fussin' and cussin' behind, travel to new worlds, new adventures. Make new friends, set yourself free, even if only temporarily. Your body may be bound with the walls it surround, yet the mind remains free if one has a book to read. It's the best solution for life while life is passing you by. So this is a poem from someone within the U.S. prison system and sent to the organization Books to Prisoners. And this is the subject of my conversation today. So today I'll be speaking with Andy Chan, president of Books to Prisoners. And as Books to Prisoners lists, their mission is to foster a love of reading behind bars, encourage the pursuit of knowledge and self-empowerment, and break the cycle of recidivism. So as Andy and I discuss, there's an interesting interplay between the punitive side and the rehabilitatory side of the U.S. prison system and the global prison systems, where people seem to be so fixated on the punitive side, on the search for justice, that they forget that unless you're a lifer, unless you're somebody serving a life sentence or a death sentence, everybody gets out. And no matter how you feel about that person or that group of people or the nature of their crime, the reality is people who leave the prison system should be leaving in a state better than they entered, because otherwise nobody benefits. People may get a sense of justice from having that punishment executed for the interim, but again, so long as people are getting out, you want them to get out in a better state, to engage with their communities, to be a part of society, and to better the world and to better their own lives. So Books to Prisoners feels that books and reading and the pursuit of knowledge is fundamental to that goal, which of course I couldn't agree more. And Andy and I talk about this in all its many interesting facets. So without further ado, please welcome Andy Chan of Books to Prisoners.
Books to Prisoners is a non-profit based in Seattle. We are one of basically a movement now of organizations which are prison book programs, sending books into individuals incarcerated in America. We weren't maybe the first, maybe the second organization, and we may not be the biggest, but we're probably second, or let's say second biggest organization. But we are very together. We have been working now for about 50 years as a non-profit, and this came about through the 1970s, the radicalization of some political folks in the 1970s. And in looking into what they could possibly do, they recognized that there was an issue, obviously, with the criminal justice system in America. And there are any number of things that you could do to respond to that. But these were book people who were thinking about this problem. And they recognized that one of the big problems was that libraries, even then, were not well funded, and access to them was fairly spotty, and they knew that sort of a radical agenda items would not be in those libraries, so they decided amongst themselves to set up some kind of project to send books into people in prison who were looking for this kind of stuff. In the intervening 5 decades, we've let's call it moderated ourselves a little bit, so we really are focused on a number of different things, but education and just general being able to read is a core part of our concern at this point in time. So I think I've gone way off target here, but basically what we do is people incarcerated across the United States will send a request for a particular thing that maybe they can't get in their prison library, or they don't have a prison library, and we do as best as we can to fill out their request and send them a package of books, dependent on whether the prison allows them to receive those. And there is no charge for this service. We fund it through entirely through donation, mostly small donations of from folks, and Similarly with books, for most of our existence, the books we send out have been donated. So oftentimes, on mostly they're used. We do get some new ones from publishers who are remaindering a title. And just in last year, we got one foundation grant, hurrah, which allowed us to buy some new books, which is really kind of important because there are, amongst the myriad of restrictions, there are one which is very prevalent, is that a prison or a prison system won't allow used books in. They only allow new books, and if we don't get them donated, then hey, yeah, the person is out of luck until last year, where we got a little bit. Sorry. Yeah, no, it was last year. We got a little bit of money in order to buy some books for those folks. I'm way off topic now. Tyle, ask me another question.
No, it's all right. Well, follow up to that is the what's the logic behind new books only? Is it just that it's too difficult to sort through all of the used books and check to see if anything's been smuggled in, or note, or just some communication with?
Yeah, basically, I mean, sort of the supposed reason for most of the restrictions is the concern about contraband and about escape plans and things like that, and anything that is not new, is going to be easier to doctor. I mean, sort of one of the things that they don't like in prison mailrooms is underlining or highlighting, and sort of the concern that is expressed to us is that a code can be put in by highlighting or underlining certain words, and also in used books, it sort of the pages obviously are a little worn and stuff, and sometimes somebody drops some of their delicious coffee on the book page, or water when they were washing their face, which you do when you're reading a book, great book where you just can't put down, and it will, it will soak up into the page and make it look as if it's water damaged. Fair enough. And the current concern is, of course, that somebody has now soaked the pages in LSD or some kind of opioid kind of thing. So, yeah, that is the purported reason. Also, the purported reason why hardback books are often disallowed from a lot of places, because you could put something down the spine, for instance. Again, they can check for these kind of things, but they don't want additional work and additional steps. They'd rather see something and be able to say, no, don't want to send that, don't want to send that, don't want to send that.
I mean, and I sort of understand that. That's fair enough. The thing that I know you guys spend a lot of time and money fighting against is the banning of books, just in terms of the subject matter. And I went through. I'm sitting here in Arizona, and I went through the banned content list that you guys have on the website for Arizona, and I was kind of expecting something that I was hoping for something a little bit more reasonable, but it was striking how unreasonable, at least it felt to me, and how extensive and almost random. So the first question is, what is the process of actually choosing a book or a song or whatever else in between to ban? Because it seems it's just a individual punitive measure that then just joins this growing list and then punishes everybody. Is that correct?
I think it's one of the things that you really have to pay attention to, and this comes up in our National Prison Book Program conversations a lot, is that I'm digressing slightly. People will ask, hey, is there a national list of all the restrictions that there are in various prisons and various prison systems? And each time someone asks it, and they ask it fairly regularly, I sort of pipe up, no, not really. And if there was, it wouldn't work for you, because it really is entirely dependent on what the prison is thinking at this point in time, what the prison system is thinking at this point in time, who you are, so which group you are makes a difference as to what you can get and what you can't get in. And then there's a lot of, let's call it, autonomy at the local level. So a prison superintendent can make a ruling for their particular facility, and a mailroom sergeant, I'm running out of fingers, the mailroom sergeant can also make a determination individually based if they had a bad day and got out the wrong side of the bed, or they did not get enough delicious coffee in the morning. So it's really completely, or not completely, but it appears to be fairly arbitrary. I totally lost track of the start of the question, in fact.
It seems so extensive and so random and so unjustified. And again, I only reviewed, at least in detail, the list for Arizona, but it was just striking. I did not find what I expected to find on there. Are you involved in any work that's trying to sort of make it a bit stricter, like it's not so easy to just have somebody wake up on the wrong side of the bed and restrict access to one work or another?
Um, well, I mean, the trouble is that we're working with so many jurisdictions. We have the Federal Bureau of Prisons. We have 50 different state departments of correction, and then we also send occasionally to county jails and sheriff's departments and stuff like that. So I mean, there's potentially anywhere between 51 and 10,000 different jurisdictions that we have to work with, and there's a limited bandwidth of what we think we can approach, especially as most of the people involved in the movement are unpaid volunteers with lives, with jobs and things like that. So we have to kind of pick and choose what the things are that we work on. And like a lot of calculations, it's often based on where do we really feel that we can have an impact. Because I mean, there are some egregious wrongs out there, but they are to do with, for instance, a jurisdiction which are adamantly not going to work with you, and so would require some kind of major lawsuit and involved hundreds of thousands of dollars and take years. Or there's a small wrong that we can, make a call to an individual superintendent and say, hey, we realize you made this decision, will you reverse it based on this and this. And those very, very typically, that's the kind of thing that we have to focus on because of the limited bandwidth that we have to deal with these kind of things, is to pick and choose what we can fight and what we can't fight. Just to give you an example, we have been, there have been a number of states over the last few years which have, banned prison book programs from sending anything in at all. Again, the purported reason is usually a concern about contraband, and that's the kind of thing that we have fought back on many times. Not every single state, because it really helps if there's a prison book program in the particular state. So, for instance, where we have pushed back and where we have been successful in pushing back are states like New York, Pennsylvania, and my own state of Washington. To give you a potted history of that, in 2019 we suddenly found a bunch of our packages returned from Washington state prisons, and we had no idea why that should be the case. So somebody did some sleuthing, and buried deep in the Washington State Department of Corrections website was a memo saying that they were no longer going to accept used books from prison book programs. And we sort of like started pushing back on that by, first of all, of course, calling the DOC and finding them saying, well, there's contraband and we don't have the manpower or whatever to deal with this. So we started going wider. We created a grassroots movement to email and call various people in the Department of Corrections and also in the political system, the state political system in Washington, and we contacted the press, both the legacy press and social media press, and also we went directly to people like the governor to ask, why is this happening? How does this make sense? We're an entirely reputable organisation doing amazing things to help people better their lives. Why are we being banned from, essentially, from prison? and sort of it took a little bit of a while, but we sort of got there. One of the key elements, I mean, all of the elements that I mentioned are really key elements, but here's an element which is particularly pertinent, and I think was the straw that broke the camel's back. So the Seattle Times did a Freedom of Information Act request to the DOC to find out, well, what is the evidence for contraband being an issue. And the DOC, the Department of Corrections, had quoted, I think, something like 18 instances of books being related to contraband. Now, they hadn't said books being sent by books as prisoners or anything else like that. So when the Seattle Times got this FOIA request information back, they found that none of the instances that were quoted by the DOC had anything to do with books being sent in by non-profits. And not only that, but this is even more ridiculous, that two of them were completely spurious, and one that really springs to my mind is that a lieutenant who had caught some contraband was named Booker. He was Lieutenant Booker, and because his name contained the word book, that was the reason why it turned up on their list of how books are related to contraband in Washington State. So, I mean, they backed off, but it also kind of demonstrates the arbitrariness and the poor thought out logic and rationale that is often used to make restrictions like this.
That's wild. And the crazy part, and the part that I find really almost funny, is that there's clearly, I mean, they recognize contraband is one thing. I mean, I suppose I sort of understand that to some extent, at least in some circumstances. But in terms of the informational side of things, I mean, I saw Sun Tzu, Art of War, as one of the books banned, as if that's going to incite prisoner violence. And it's funny that they recognize that books clearly can make an impact on behavior, but they selectively choose to see the negative side, if there even is one. But the reality is the same thinking can be applied to say we should be prioritizing getting these people whatever book they need. I mean, it perhaps is the greatest educational tool that they will have access to during their time in prison.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're strong believers in self-empowerment and for people to understand where they came from and things like that. So oftentimes what we do want to focus, and obviously there is some racial disparity in who goes to prison. So we like to keep, if we can, a fairly significant section of African-American titles, you know, African-American studies and things like that. But that is one of the major areas where things get rejected for content, and the quote whenever we get it back is often why something is being rejected is because of racial content, because the thinking, I think, is that anything to do with race is gonna start off a race riot rather than help people to understand where they're from and why they're in the position that they are.
We'll return to my conversation with Andy in just a minute, but I'd like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Evancer. Freedom of information is at the bedrock of free and open societies. It's the ability to engage with new and challenging ideas that give us the tools to pursue truth and create a life better for ourselves and our communities. But today's social, political, and information landscapes are fraught with misinformation and bad actors that seek to confuse, obstruct, and misdirect our attention, priorities, interests, and more importantly, the world around us. And that's where Evancer can help. Evancer.org is an evidence aggregator where users crowdsource the best evidence on both sides of empirical yes or no questions. There's no suppression of minority opinion, and evidence is open to public rebuttal, testing its strength, and exposing any weaknesses. You can contribute evidence and track how it sways opinion, promote strong evidence to make it more visible, or create your own inquiry, starting with a simple yes or no question. Previous attempts at alternative news, information, and social media platforms have quickly devolved into echo chambers worse than partisan legacy media, but Evancer is built to foster balanced discussion of controversial topics, welcoming to anyone on any side of any topic. So, if you're interested in learning more about Evancer or ready to give it a try, you can simply follow the link in the description or visit evancer.org to sign up. It's completely free and ready for you to join the conversation. And an extra special thanks to Evancer today, as I will be donating their support to Books to Prisoners, helping to support a world of truth and openness. So once again, a big thanks to Evancer for sponsoring today's episode, and now, back to my conversation with Andy. What books, if any, do you think are worthy of being banned, because the obvious example that comes to mind is, for the white nationalist populations within prisons. I'm not sure it's a great idea to give them free and open access to Mein Kampf or many of these other pretty startling works. So obviously African American studies is, to equate those is disgusting, but I guess I see in general the logic behind doing what they can to mitigate the hard racial lines that seem to exist in the prison system.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand if the logic was that here's a book that describes how to create Molotov cocktails and how to
Sure.
disable like sort of prison alarm systems and things like that, but that isn't typically what is being rejected. Is basically anything in terms of what we are prepared to send and what we're not prepared to send. We definitely have folks who are of a mind to self-censor, or not self-censor, but censor based on content ourselves from a, it's no surprise a lot of our volunteers are more, are sort of more moderate, liberal or lefty. But and you mentioned the book Mein Kampf, and this actually has come up more than once that somebody will hold up a letter and say, "Huh, this guy wants Mein Kampf. We're not going to send that," and I sort of say, well, just hang on a moment, just one moment there. What if this guy is a student of history? What if he wants to understand how the National Socialist movement came about, and with a view to how do we want to, how could we avoid this? How could a society avoid this in the future? Let's not knee-jerk responses, because books are books, and they have a number of different uses. And yes, we get a lot of requests for a Sartre and Norse gods and stuff like that, and a lot of the time it does seem the thinking behind this is that this is a white nationalist, and that is certainly the case, but there's also people who really are just interested in Norse mythology and things like that. So I think there needs to be some differentiation between a simple ban or simple censorship versus, well, what is the reasoning behind, and are we in support of that? I mean, I'm not going to say that we will not stock anything, but what we definitely do say to volunteers at the organisation at both prisons is, if this makes you feel uncomfortable, if this is something that you think that you don't want to send because you think this is going to further some thinking that you don't like or don't approve of, you don't have to do that request. And if enough people feel, ooh, that's kind of skeezy or whatever, and don't want to deal with it won't get done. We don't make anybody do what they feel uncomfortable doing.
Yeah, I would agree. And my thinking also is just that, as you said, option A, they're a student of history, and there's a reasonable good faith reason for a request for something like Mein Kampf for the Norse mythology and so on, in which case, great. And in the case that they do have an interest to more nefarious ends, I think the reality is that the difference in the outcome of their behavior is likely not to be affected in the aggregate just by access to that book in that moment, So it seems worth, the more information, the more people that have free access, whether they're in prison or not, is sort of where I land. But I get it's a road to hell is paved with good intentions, is sort of how I read this.
Yeah, and like I said, we don't prescribe. That's pro, not pre. We don't prescribe any particular texts from being donated to us. We don't encourage certainly some things being sent to us that are sometimes offered. But I mean, it's more complicated than it first appears sometimes, I think.
In general, I guess there's two aspects to the prison system, at least ideally, which is that there's this punitive element. There's an element of justice, and you did something wrong, and now it's time to serve a punishment that fits the crime. And the other element is rehabilitation. And obviously, you want to reduce recidivism, and you want to see people leave the prison system to go on and have great lives that contribute to society. And I feel those are often at odds No, they're not. I don't believe they're actually at odds, at least from the level of. I think many people at least perceive them as odds. So do you find a lot of resistance from the standpoint of why are we going to take all this time and money and energy to get prisoners books? They're not. They shouldn't be entitled. That's a luxury that I'm not interested in affording them. Is that a sentiment you hear often?
You do hear that, certainly. We table at events, and even in liberal Seattle, you'll have people come up and say that the very same thing. But I think you're absolutely right that almost anybody can accept the idea of recidivism bad, and of helping rehabilitate someone good. I mean, that I've used that tack when I've spoken to more conservative folks, Republicans and folks like that. Say, almost everybody is going to get out. So how do you want the person to get out? Do you want them to be, all they have faced is anger at the system which has done this to them, and all the access to information has been the other incarcerated folks, so people experienced in violent assault and theft and burglary and robbery and all those kind of things? Or do you want to give another option? And if you want to give that other option to people, are you willing to pay for it yourself through your taxes so that libraries can be fully funded? Or are you okay if you're not going to do that, if you're not going to pay the hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars in that? Are you okay with people who are willing to pay for it to donate in order for this to happen? And I mean, I've rarely come across anyone who's willing to go through this argument and say that they don't think there should be rehabilitation, and they don't think people should come out better, and they don't think they should therefore have access to books. I mean, that's that. I mean, I have yet to come across anybody who really thinks that is the right course of action. So we think that we can appeal across the political spectrum as the value of what we do. Even, as I said, most of the folks who are involved with us are fairly, let's call them Democrat slash lefty.
Well, I think that is one of the great values that you do bring is, like you said, when you have the opportunity to have that discussion and make that argument, it doesn't surprise me to hear that everybody's receptive. The problem, I suppose, is the people who don't get to have that conversation with you, and whether they know it or not, are far more consumed by the punitive aspect. And, if they're not sort of coaxed to take the time to think about what you just spelt out, it's just not something front of mind. You could quickly get them to agree, but I think that just going through that exercise, I think probably has a huge impact, at least on people on the outside's interest and ability to help people and prioritize the rehabilitation component.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, I haven't really come across much in the way of rejecting our arguments, except of course, the departments of correction who don't necessarily really want to, but I think that's mostly because they don't want to have that conversation. They don't have the time. It's so difficult to talk to someone in authority there. You call up to dispute an issue, and nobody answers, and you get a voicemail, or it rings and rings, and you call up 3 different times and get 3 different people, and they all say different things about who you should talk to. So I think it's again, if you can have that conversation, you usually can be fairly persuasive with almost anybody. But if they don't have it, if they're not willing to have that conversation, that's where the issues are.
I see. And again, this is the way those conversations transpire is quite divided across political lines, I imagine. I mean, do you see that there's quite a stark contrast between how people in each, I guess broadly speaking, how they associate themselves with the two political parties interface on this topic?
I'm gonna have to say I assume so. I don't actually ask them what their political background is before we get engaged in the conversation. But I mean, it seems fairly, our interaction on a face-to-face or sort of in meeting contexts, it's usually folks in Washington State, and sort of you can fairly standardly expect anybody in Seattle and most people in Spokane to be Democrat, and anybody that you're talking to outside of those cities, there's odds on there of Republican. So I mean, usually that goes along those lines. And yes, the arguments are pretty standard that folks, who are concerned and worried about safety and security will come with the idea that they want to punish people, and folks who then the opposite for the Democrat folks.
Sure. And let me ask you I like asking this question in one way or another, sort of irrespective of the topic. When any sort of activity or behavior or so on is prescribed, as in the case of providing the incarcerated with free and open access to books. But if you could imagine the U.S. prison system on the whole had sort of what I imagine would be your dream of full unrestricted access, full access. Every prisoner had more or less any book within reason that they wanted within a short time span. How different do you think the U.S. prison system looks, and society at large? Do you see it as something that could just totally change things, or is this just one important part of the puzzle, but a part of the puzzle nonetheless?
That's a tough question. It's part of the puzzle, and that's, I think, one of the things that we have to be fairly clear about. We understand that we are not the panacea, that sort of open access to books means everybody comes out with a fresh new look on life. There are some folks, there's folks with all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of deficits and all kinds of terrible experience in the past that sort of take a lot more than books. I mean, there are going to be some folks who need some serious counselling and or sort of work on economic issues and racial disparity issues and all kinds of things. So we're not dumb enough to think that that what we do will fix everything, but we know that across the spectrum that we do have a significant impact on a number of the people that we have worked with, and through years and decades of having done this, sort of people have, our volunteers have said, or sort of the general public has said, well, how do you know that you've made any kind of impact at all? What you're doing has made any impact? And so we created ourselves a little binder of letters of folks who had written back to basically say what kind of impact we had made on folks, and sort of the people who wrote to us, who told us this unsolicited for the most part, would really go into some significant detail about where they're from, how what are the kind of factors that made a difference. And it wasn't only necessarily the books, although most of the time it is the books that made a difference, something that sparked a difference in outlook, in the way that you looked at things. But also it was the fact that we would spend the time to actually bother to respond to someone's request. That in itself was a pretty significant part of things. Here's one other thing, that we're a small volunteer driven organization. We get 12,000 plus requests a year, which is quite a lot for a small volunteer group to manage. But I mean, it's just a drop in the bucket. So certainly, if we could expand that out to the greater prison population in the United States, which I want to guess is still in the region of about 2 million people, I mean, that is a government level response. And if our experience of being able to affect change for a proportion of the folks that we work with significantly could be expanded to the kind of level on the national scale, I mean, that would, I think, make a real impact on how people live their lives.
I mean, I would certainly think so. And you made a comment that you guys didn't feel you're dumb enough to think that it's going to make all the difference in the world. But I might even be more optimistic. I mean, maybe it's my own naivete, but like, the way I sort of conceptualize this is there's two different ways or two different reasons, fundamental motivations that the prisoners might be interested. One is works of nonfiction where it's more about education and developing skills and so on. And the other is the impact of a good story. And when I was reading through some of the testimonial, or I don't know if testimonials is the right word, but some of the responses, some of the letters that incarcerated people have sent you guys, the impact is palpable. And I think the greatest metric for that is people who go so far as to not only become avid readers, but writers. I mean, some of the poems and short prose that was written was wonderful. I mean, even just in terms of the quality, I mean, you can tell that it's made a big impact, and it's also reflected in their skills. So do you feel there's a genre that's more important than another? Is there more value in a great redemption story, a great work of fiction, versus textbooks and the tools to develop practical skills for when they get out?
Yeah, well, let me give you what I think is a salient example. I don't know exactly when it was. It's got to have been 20 odd years ago. We found ourselves in a financial pickle, and we recognized that we weren't going to be able to continue working at the scale that we had been working at. We just didn't have the money for it. So we had to cut back something somehow. And how do you, when there is so much need, how do you cut back on anything? And one of the proposals put out there was, well, you know, we focus on education, so maybe we should stick to non-fiction and just not send in fiction. And the response as a group was fairly overwhelmingly no. We think that fiction is at least as important as non-fiction when it comes to education and self-empowerment, and because it's the gateway, because it's the thin end of the wedge. If you can get someone started on reading, then they can even on some stuff, I don't want to call it trash, on some kind of stuff like Danielle Steele or some other kind of popular genre author, they you know, this sort of that can get them started. And who knows, you sort of, next time you send them something, you're sending them some kind of more complicated genre of fiction, and then eventually they're looking for something deeper, they're looking for some classical literature, and that opens up this idea, this I am learning so much from this kind of thing. So I think, you know, it's a bit of it's fallacy to think that fiction isn't important in this sphere. It's crucial, it's essential, and it's especially essential to many of the folks that we kind of work with, many of whom you may have noticed in your reading have, you know, didn't get anything, gained almost nothing from, and certainly read almost nothing during their their time in school. And so here is an opportunity for them to start reading, and you can't start someone reading on something complicated, some complicated non-fiction book, because it will turn a lot of folks off. Get them started on something simple, something to keep them turning the pages, and then they have a path from there to more complex ideas and thoughts and reading. So
that definitely makes sense. I mean, that is in line with my intuition, because I kind of saw the fictional work as you say, sort of a catalyst for self-empowerment and broader education. But yeah, it seems no matter how motivated somebody might be, you hand them a physics textbook or a mechanic, like whatever they're interested in, whether it's vocational training or the beginning of a career in academia. But without that spark, it does seem very, very difficult. So I would agree, and I'm not surprised. And to that end, you've mentioned it a few times, but I'll read just word for word. The mission of Books to Prisoners is, quote, to foster a love of reading behind bars, encourage the pursuit of knowledge and self-empowerment, and to break the cycle of recidivism. So the question is, which do you feel you're successful in the mission, and which of those are you most successful at, and which is the biggest challenge?
um, yeah, it's a lofty mission statement, and I think we hit the mark. I mean, here's the thing. Again, we don't take surveys of folks. We don't expect people to write back to us to thank us or any of those kind of things. It's the icing on the cake when someone does. But we don't we don't unfortunately have a great way of creating metrics on our outcomes. So I mean, sort of, I have to believe that we have an impact both on self empowerment and on education and on recidivism, because sometimes people tell us that. I know that's not a great. It's certainly not a scientific proof of what we do, but people keep writing, people keep asking for stuff, that I mean, sort of the number of requests that we have gotten over the years when I started keeping the records went up very significantly from 1994 all the way to about just before COVID, when of course it took a bit of a bump, but has been starting to go up again. So there is an impact, and people want the stuff that we can get to them. So, in terms of again, it's hard to say this is proof, but I mentioned earlier on that sort of we'd often get letters, not often, over the episodically we'd get letters from people saying that they had received stuff and what kind of an impact it was, and we wanted to be able to show this to people who ask the question, well, what kind of impact do you have, and how do you know that you have that? And we thought, you know what we could do? We could create a book and put these letters in there. And then we kind of realised, we don't have anybody's permission. We weren't about to create a book without people's, with individuals' writings and not have their permission. So we, for I think a year-long period, put little flyers into some of the books that we sent out and saying, hey, if you liked getting this book and you think that if you want to maybe tell us something of the impact that it and previous ones that you've got from us have had, please write back to us, give us permission. And we got a ton of letters back from folks at that point in time. And we turned that into a book, which I won't say is available at all good bookstores, because it's not, but it is available on our website. And sort of when we give this to people, when people donate in order to get it, it can be really, really eye opening. The kind of impact that people will talk about that you wouldn't. I mean, even it can be fairly subtle if you were observing them in the prison, and you wouldn't necessarily know what is it that has changed this guy from how he was when he first came in to who he is right now. And it's only because here he is, he spent the time writing to us to tell us this that we know.
I mean, I should give you the context. My background is in chemistry, so I in general try to think like a scientist, but at the same time I hate the datafication, the quantification. Not everything needs to be looked at through that lens, but at the same time, the reason I ask is because I imagine the more that you can sort of quantify and precisely articulate the benefit, the more you'll be able to get those grants or encourage donations, and it may be a necessary evil. So do you know if there's ever, and whether it's by you or by third parties, universities, government institutions, and so on, are there groups doing research into trying to really get a more, again, precise sense of the impact, just for the purposes of trying to continue?
Yes, you're right. People love numbers, and if you can quantify things, it seems to have at least certainly more of an impact than qualitative data, because qualitative data at the level that we get it is sounds great, looks great, but is anecdotal in the sense that it's one person. But we, as I said, are predominantly volunteer driven, and so the our capacity to even function at the level that we do is often strained, and then trying to put in something like a quantitative study is, I think, fairly beyond us. I mean, we have done a couple of different surveys from time to time. One of them was fairly um, illustrative of it was a survey, again a non-scientific one, because I mean it's so difficult to make anything particularly scientific. But what basically we sent out again these slips of paper in book requests. I mean, so in responses to book requests, to ask about what people's prison libraries were like, what access to them was like, and things like that. And we got a fairly decent response. But I mean, any social scientist would say, well, that wasn't scientific, and they'd be absolutely right, because we don't have any way of controlling that access to the information.
Sure. I mean, again, that all makes sense. It's just sort of a shame because I like numbers. Many people like numbers. I get why they like numbers, but at the same time, I feel like the intuition behind this work is sufficient, or at least should be sufficient, because as far as I'm concerned, there's no doubt about how those studies would bear out. I mean, the details, it's all speculation, but the idea that more access to more books and more educational material will result in anything but a net outcome and a net positive impact to the prison system is almost absurd. But yeah, it's a shame that without the journal publication, a lot of people just aren't willing to engage with it seriously enough.
Yeah, certainly. But I mean, like you say, I mean, on a personal level, I feel that if we have had these the impact on this even a small fragment of the population of our incarcerated folks, it, and sort of the book that we created and the letters that we get indicate that is very much the case. Even if it's 1% of the population, or 0.5% of the population, or 10%, or whatever it is, that those people were worthwhile. It's like that story of the hokey story of the person walking along the beach when with all the jellyfish on the dried up on the land, and sort of then throwing back one or two, and their friend saying, well, what, this isn't going to make a difference to the population of jellyfish. And the person responds, well, it does for the one that I threw back. So and that's kind of how I feel. If it makes an impact for this person that we made an impact for, even if it didn't for 10 other people, I think that is value.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Especially in this context. I mean, the changing one person's life is often undervalued as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it really is that simple. It takes a few people to change the whole game. So I couldn't agree.
Yeah, well, just think about it. I mean, you personally in your day-to-day life, how many, maybe not you, Tyler, because I'm sure you have a lot of impact, but let's say the average person, how many people do they come into contact with during their lifetime? How many people can they have impact on, and how many people can they have positive impact on? So if you're just thinking about, well, I had a positive during my lifetime, I had a positive impact on 20 people, and you're thinking you had a positive impact on 20 people. Well, compare that to 350 million Americans. That's nothing. It doesn't mean anything, but of course it does, because that is 20. It's still 20 people.
Yeah, no, 100%. I don't know how you change that perspective. How do you get people to realize that the goal, everyone has very, very lofty goals, and I think social media and all the other things that are on the top of people's minds and front of their tongues is exacerbating it greatly, because we are exposed to more and more people. It feels like if you don't reach those crazy numbers, well then yeah, you've made a trivial impact, but that's not real life, and you need not reach hundreds of thousands, millions of people. 20 people who you've meaningfully affected is more than enough.
Absolutely. And I mean, I am going to give credit to people. I'm going to give credit to people in that they understand this, because we, I'm touching wood and I've got my fingers crossed when I'm saying this so I don't jinx it. We have found over the course of the time that I've been at Books Prisoners that the amount of donations that we get to support our organisation has gone up. It's okay. There has been occasional setbacks the year where our income has been slightly less or whatever, but I mean the general trend has been upwards, and it's not upwards simply on hey, people are donating more. It's that more people are donating, and I think and oftentimes at fairly low levels, like $10 or something like that. And I think it's because people do recognize the value that is done at this individual level, that this impact will have, and it will have a geometric effect. One person affects 5 other people, and that 5 people affects 5 other people, so that's already 25, and then you multiply that by 5 of the people they are affected. So there is a multiplier from the work that we do. And I think people recognize that when they hear these individual stories, that they do resonate, they do sound true to people, they do sound as if they are indicative of an impact, and an impact that is valuable to us as people, as a society.
We have a little bit more time, so I want to ask you one, what may seem like a strange question. I mean, you tell me. But we've spent a lot of time talking about the banning of books, but to sort of explore the opposite end of the spectrum, and I know this is beyond the scope of Books to Prisoners, so I guess I'll really direct this to you personally. But do you feel, I was thinking about it, and you think, we have mandatory reading lists, mandatory, within reason, within K through 12 public school system. Do you feel that perhaps reading could be implemented as a part of a broader rehabilitation program within prisons, where it's not only accessible but almost mandatory? Nobody's getting in trouble, nobody's going to solitary for not picking up the book, but as a formalized part of the rehabilitation component of prisons. Is that something that you would ever find yourself in support of, or do you think it should always be, it's at your disposal, but it's never forced?
That's a tough question. I'm not the kind of person, if you knew me better, to sort of to make people do stuff that they don't want to do, and I'm cognizant that if you try and force some people to do what they don't want to do, then you will turn them off from the thing that you wanted to happen in the first place. But I also recognize that from a mainstream political perspective, we as a society are, I think it's fair to say, lacking in understanding of civics, and lacking in a willingness to look at how other people think and where they're coming from. And I think if you had, as you say, a mandatory, not mandatory set list of books that people should read, and maybe have a civic, I've inverted commas, air commas here, that people have to read before they get released, and have a conversation about it with the people around them, that there would only be some positives. I find it a struggle to think that there would be any negatives from that conversation. I mean, I can imagine conversations getting heated, and people not necessarily agreeing at the end of them, but that there would be real value in the reading and the conversations just happening, in terms of attempts at understanding. Not everybody will come to any kind of understanding with the others around them, but again, a percentage will, and it would make a difference. I mean, all theoretical, but that's an opinion. I guess that would be my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it sounds like we would have a lot of common ground, in general. But I agree. Forcing people is, I am that way. Whether even if it's something I've already identified, I like. The moment I feel somebody's forcing it on me, I very quickly learn to not like it. So, I agree. But at the same time, like I agree that like I can't really imagine it not having a negative impact, or not a positive impact if it were to happen. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. But okay, I just want to make sure that anyone who's listening and wants to help out knows the best path to donate. So if you don't mind just giving a quick explanation of how people can donate, whether it's books, money, or time.
Yeah, well, if you live in Seattle or somewhere nearby, you are welcome to email us. That's at books2prisoners@live.com to ask about volunteering. It's sometimes we are oversubscribed because we have a fairly small space, but if you are committed and want to see the space, we would be happy to have folks along. You could also email for financial donations. That would be really cool. And if you want to know more about the organisation, there's a fair amount of information on the website, which is www.books2prisoners.net. In terms of book donations, that's a little bit more complex, and rather than going and finding an address and throwing 100 boxes of Danielle Steele romantic novels at us, again, please email us to tell us what you have, whether it's new, in what condition it is, whether it's a hardback, those kind of things, and what subject it's in. And we can tell you whether that's something that we can use or that we can't use, because again, we have a small space, a small storage space, and so we can't handle vast amounts of things which aren't going to get requested. So hopefully, yes, that's the basics of the information. Thanks, Tyler.
And I hope, I mean, you'll have to keep me updated. It would be to my great pleasure to hear that people listened and then ended up doing something actionable. So I certainly hope everybody does, whoever's made it this far into the conversation. And Andy, again, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Tyler.